Welcome to the Irish Revolution. Today we're going to look at the period between the Easter Rising and the general election of 1918. Assuming you haven't watched my other videos, let me remind you what has come before this. On Easter Monday 1916, 2,000 rebels declared the Irish Republic in Dublin. They had no popular support, and if anything, they were widely disliked, even hated, and within a week, the Irish Republic had been extinguished. Irish politics, hitherto dominated by the constitutionalist, peaceful, Home Rulers, Irish Parliamentary Party, and on the other side, the Unionist Party, would be transformed, and within a few years, the Irish War of Independence would break out. It was not obvious at the time that the Republican movement would prevail over these forces, or would emerge from this with anything. The events of the years following the Easter Rising were to prove essential to understanding what came in 1919. Today, I'm going to take us through the events of 1916 after the Easter Rising, and 1917 and 1918, the gestation period of the War of Independence. I'll leave us at the 1918 general election, which I'll look at in a future episode. So we can more or less break this up into three distinct parts. Number one, the British repression, martial law, some might say overreaction. Number two, by-election defeats, which led the way for the blowout in the general election, although maybe blowout's not a fair description. We'll talk about that. And number three, the conscription crisis. Now, I would argue that without the conscription crisis, there would not have been a War of Independence. Or there may not have been a War of Independence, let's say. There certainly wouldn't have been as strong a Sinn Fein movement. So let's deal with number one, martial law. So here's a quote from John Dillon, big guy in the Irish Parliamentary Party at the time. Quote, "You are letting loose a river of blood. It is the first rebellion that ever took place in Ireland where you had the majority on your side. It is the fruit of our life work, and now you are washing out our whole life work in a sea of blood." Unquote. Let's put this all in context. After the Rising, Dublin city centre was in ruins. The people were angry. They threw fruit at the rebels. They were heckled. The rebels were very surprised in some cases about the level of contempt they felt. But as martial law is declared and the British get a bit heavy-handed and pass down death sentences in rather farcical court-martials, the public mood begins to change. Another aspect to look at, the Irish love a good martyr story. Perhaps it's something to do with the Catholicism of the country or what, but martyrdom is a very Irish thing. The public mood changed in favour of the rebels. Martial law was declared throughout the country. The vast majority of the country had been peaceful and were not in league with the Republicans. This rubbed people up in the wrong way. General Maxwell, the British military governor, believed that, quote, "It is in the Irish character to loudly proclaim loyalty, and such protestations are pouring in, but this is, in my opinion, a reason we should be all the more watchful," unquote. So the British were suspicious. Maxwell wanted to arm the unarmed Dublin police, believing that there wouldn't have been a rebellion at all if they had been armed. British forces began seizing Irish volunteer weapons all over the country. The volunteers managed to hide quite a few of them before seizure. 3,430 men and 79 women had been arrested. Many of these had taken no part in the fighting. Many of them were activists in the Griffiths Sinn Fein party, which actually took no part in the rebellion despite the protestations from the British. John Dillon of the Irish Parliamentary Party, very much opposed to the Republicans, was ratcheting up his criticism of British policy, which he saw as maddening and was making a bad situation worse. Remember the quote at the beginning. Later in that speech he said, quote, "This series of executions is doing more harm than any Englishman in this house can possibly fathom," unquote. Now, his speech in the House of Commons was, well, extraordinary, as in out of the ordinary. This kind of speech didn't happen in the House of Commons. It was very, very strong against British policy in Ireland, and the Unionists actually pointed to it as an indication of the Irish attitude and why they would always oppose Home Rule. Because, well, even though he wasn't for the Sinn Feiners or the Republican movement, he was certainly unhappy with the way British were dealing with things in Ireland. And perhaps he felt it was a good argument for Home Rule, actually, for Irish people to take charge of things, you know. The river of blood in the speech was a reference to the executions, which had started on May the 3rd with the execution of Padraig Pearse, Thomas MacDonagh and Thomas Clark. The executions were crucial in moving public opinion towards the Republicans. Eamon de Valera avoided execution due to his American connections. The Irish prisoners, 1,600 of whom were in England, became a running sore for the British administration. Prisoner aid societies were set up and were an important propaganda weapon for the Republicans. The experience of confinement made leaders out of previously unknown men, in particular and most famously Michael Collins, who had been imprisoned at Frongoch in Wales. Now, the Prime Minister visited Ireland in mid-May after the executions, and he went to see prisoners in Richmond Barracks. He could see that many of the men were just normal country fellas who had been swept up after the rising and felt the British should start combing out innocence, unquote. Of the 3,430 men arrested, 1,424 would be released within a few weeks. Obviously, there wasn't absolute unanimity in the Irish society. The Unionist Irish Times, having written on 1st of May, quote, "The surgeon's knife has been put to the corruption in the body of Ireland, and its course must not be stayed until the whole malignant growth has been removed." The historian Charles Townsend points out that while the country was not with the rebels, they were not necessarily against them, and that there may have been a class element involved too. Now, certainly at the beginning, of course, the vast majority of Irish people were against the rebels, but this changed, and it changed pretty quick too. The more middle-class areas displayed strong pro-British or pro-military tendencies, but amongst the poor there was a great deal of sympathy, especially once the rebels had been defeated, not counting, of course, separation women I talked about in previous episodes. Another factor which may explain some of the support the rebels were to retroactively get was their piety. This went down well in a deeply Catholic Ireland. Most of the leaders, with a handful of exceptions, were deeply devout. And while the Catholic hierarchy were, well, let's say deeply again, were deeply conservative and not about to support armed struggle against the status quo, there were signs of a softening and an openness, particularly among younger clergy, to Republican ideas. This was all very important to, there's that word again, deeply Catholic Ireland of the early 20th century. There was a so-called German plot in May 1918 when Dublin Castle alleged that the Republicans were in league with the German Empire in order to kick off another insurrection. This would merit an episode of its own, of course. I won't go into details about it here. A number of significant Sinn Feiners were arrested. This, if anything, ended up helping Republicans and the more militant wing of the movement. In the summer of 1916, the British tried to resolve the Irish question by fast-forwarding Home Rule. As ever, they were unable to reach agreement with the Unionists or to satisfy the Constitutionalist Home Rule Party regarding the Ulster question. Anyway, it all seems to be a moot point, as Irish politics was in such ferment at this time that it was unclear whether public opinion would have even settled for Home Rule at this point. Okay, point number 2, by-elections. By Christmas 1916, most of the prisoners had been released, and they decided to challenge the Home Rule Party in the North Roscommon by-election. The Home Rule Party was not prepared for elections. They were not used to them. They were the Irish establishment, seeing themselves as a natural establishment or elite for the new Home Rule order in Ireland. They hadn't had to fight in actual contested elections very often, except against Unionist candidates, and by and large these contests were already decided by the local demographics. There were one or two cases. Sinn Fein ran some exploratory campaigns, but it's hard to see if they ever took them really that seriously. The Home Rule movement was the movement in Ireland. It was a catch-all party. Michael Laffin has described the Home Rule Party as a catch-all party, like I just said, a bit like the Democratic Party in the United States. It was made up of caucuses with different interest groups, but the most important thing was the party machine. Sinn Fein in some ways mimicked this, trying its best to avoid class conflict, for example, or agrarian campaigns. One of the most striking things about the Irish Revolution is how conservative the revolutionaries were. This whole culture of patronage was now to be upended by this new and exciting force. Count Plunkett, father to one of the signatories of the proclamation, Joseph, won handily. Plunkett won and he set off the new Sinn Fein juggernaut. Sinn Fein had nothing to do with the rising, but they got the blame in the British press and the establishment, so Arthur Griffith's party was basically taken over by the Republicans, and its dual monarchist position was later discreetly dropped in a party convention in October 1917, when Griffith stepped down and was replaced as leader by Eamon de Valera. And de Valera, of course, was the sole surviving commandant of the Easter Rising. Arthur Griffiths, who wasn't involved in the violence, of course, had a huge national profile as a prominent journalist. Michael Collins, who would go on to be such a key figure, was still practically unknown at this stage, although that would change in the not too distant future. The Irish volunteers and the political Sinn Fein movement were learning on the job, and were learning quickly, and in some cases becoming sophisticated political actors. John Redmond, leader of the Constitutionalist Home Rule Party, who was crushed by the by-election victory of Count Plunkett and the rise in popularity of Sinn Fein, wrote a memorandum saying that it would be natural for voters to want to change. Let the Irish people replace us by all means, by other, and I hope better men, if they so choose. This incredible document wasn't published, but it indicates and offers a portent for the disaster that would await the Irish Parliamentary Party. Another by-election came along in May 1917 in South Longford, and Sinn Féin put forward a more radical candidate, Joe McGuinness, who had been sentenced to prison for his role in the Easter Rising. Eamon de Valera, who is now perhaps the most influential among the Republicans due to his special cachet of being the only surviving commandant of the 1916 Rising, was cautious, worrying that they would lose and thus damaging the movement. In the end they won, but only just by 37 votes. The fact that they won at all was indeed impressive, but the small margin indicated that the IPP was far from beaten just yet. In June 1917, the remaining prisoners were released and de Valera was chosen to contend the upcoming vacancy in East Clare. By the way, why were the prisoners released? I've just kind of skipped over this. I often think this was a huge miscalculation by the British, from a certain perspective obviously. Like for example, look at Spain and Catalonia today. They are still political prisoners almost a year later, despite them not having really committed any act of political violence. There I'm exposing my own bias, if you will, okay? So it is rather incredible that the prisoners in Ireland, in the Irish case, who led a rebellion in Dublin, did get released. That will need its own episode as there's quite a lot to unpack there, and I've made that sound way more simple than it really is. De Valera, or Dev as he was known, won the contest handily by a 2-1 margin. W.T. Cosgrave, who would go on to be the leader of the Free State, shortly afterwards won the by-election for Kilkenny City. According to Michael Laffin, and I'm really stealing from him for this section, these by-election victories convinced most of the militarists that politics could work and that the Home Rule Party could be defeated by its own methods. In just a few short months, Sinn Féin had gone from being a glorified pressure group with limited appeal and a few councillors to being a mass political movement with huge momentum on its side. Sinn Féin suffered a number of setbacks in early 1918, losing in South Armagh, Waterford City and East Tyrone. Although Sinn Féin pointed to local conditions in each one of them, for example Waterford being a Redmondite stronghold, it did form a kind of pattern and they lost some of their momentum. One of the great what-ifs of Irish history is what would have happened if the British had not introduced conscription, because this is what truly made Sinn Féin the great national force it would become. So, number 3, the conscription crisis. There was a lot of enlistment in the first months of the war. This levelled off quite quickly. Ireland was the only part of the UK not subject to conscription. The Germans launched a new massive offensive on the Western Front, and the Allies needed soldiers and fast. Ireland was seen as a good source. However, it soon became clear that the British would need to employ almost as many soldiers to enforce conscription as they would get soldiers from the policy. So the whole thing was to become a debacle and underlined once again the total lack of insight in London to Irish affairs, something we still see today, lamentably. Both parties opposed conscription, but because the Irish volunteers had literally fought the British Empire in recent memory, they were seen as a more radical and muscular option. Sinn Féin also benefited from now being in league with a campaign with the Catholic Church, which was adamantly opposed to conscription. Griffiths won a by-election in East Cavan, ending the bad run of Sinn Féin results. The British had arrested a large number of Sinn Féiners. The Home Rulers were left untouched. When conscription failed, Sinn Féin got the credit, and the Home Rulers looked weak by comparison. John Dillon, the new leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, actually believed that the British wanted to manufacture Sinn Féiners. Sinn Féin were on the march. The Home Rule Party were battered and destroyed. There will be a general election in December 1918, and Sinn Féin were positioned perfectly for it. So, thanks a lot for watching, this has been great. Yeah, so I picked up a few subscribers since the Irish Thermopylae video, I hope you like that. I hope the audio quality is better here. Every episode I'm doing something different with the audio. I'm not sure if I'm making it better or making it worse, so please tell me in the comments. And this is well, the end of the Easter Rising cycle of videos, I suppose. I don't know what to make of them. You let me know in the comments what you think, but I'm going to try something a bit different. This episode I've spoken with notes. I'm trying to be a bit more natural. The other videos I read a script and I felt a bit robotic or something. I didn't really like it that much. So tell me what you think in the comments. Do you prefer this way of doing it, or maybe a bit more structured? I don't know. I'm a bit worried I'll just kind of say something a bit mad, you know, off script. So like, I'm going to say some things like that. Maybe not all of them are correct, you know, but if I do get something wrong, say it in the comments. It's probably something I just said off cuff or without really thinking about it. I don't think I'm making any fundamental errors, okay? So, finally, there's going to be 2 types of videos now in the future. I'm going to have like a month-by-month breakdown of what's happening in the Irish Revolution. So, the next one, I don't know if I'm going to do a September one. Probably I'll do an October one. I'll do one for October 1918, where I'll talk in detail about the events of October 1918. And then I'm going to do a more thematic one. So, for example, an episode about the IRA in Cork, or the Doyle Courts, or the Belfast Boycott, or the War of Independence in Donegal, which I don't know a lot about, so I'd have to do a lot of reading for that, actually. So, you know, let me know if you like that kind of thing, and hopefully we can make the channel grow. And we're getting closer to the important centenary events. In January we're going to have the first Dáil, Solahead Beg, things like that. In December we're going to have the general election that kicked it all off. So please subscribe if you like the video, and tell your friends, family and everyone you know. Hopefully we can make this channel grow. Thank you.